morning. So we're going to talk a little bit about data. This might be a review for some folks. This might be a primer for new folks. If you have some knowledge to share, we want that too, so don't be afraid to raise your hand, ask questions, and be like, by the way, we also did this and it worked for us, because let's all get on the same page with it. If you want to advance the slide, we actually, we're going to just do a brief data overview, and then we actually have a group activity. We know we're the last session of the day. Maybe you're getting ready for your hike or field trip or whatever you're doing. We figured you could have a little bit of fun with some of the data sets we pulled together, and then we'll do a brief report from each group and get a feel for the different types of data that are out there. Okay, so data literacy, much like information literacy, we want the ability to collect, manage, evaluate, and apply data in a critical manner. There's really 6 pieces of this, but it is kind of always a moving target. The processing and analysis part, which is usually done with the aid of programs and software, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The data management and organization, we'll talk about some best practices with that too. How we preserve it. Different databases and data formats, the ethics and attribution of dealing with your data, and what we mean by quality and what supporting documentation you may or may not need with data. So for us, you have some options. Really, there's 2. So you have the research question, which sort of informs what you need to do. And then one path you can take is to head to, do I collect my own data? Because that's certainly an option. That comes with some other decisions that need to be made. Am I doing an experiment? And I am doing a survey? What tools do I use? What's my data management plan? And of course, the last part is always like, do I have to ask the IRB, right? Especially for those in college, colleges and universities. Then the second option is always, well, do I just look for a pre-existing data set? And then how does that work? It comes with, where do I find it? Who collected it? How was it collected? When was it collected? Is the sample size or is the information sort of significant enough for me to include? Is there some sort of documentation that I need to read through? What format it is it in? Is it clean? This idea of clean, which means that are things consistent? Are the variables clearly labeled? Is it not missing anything? And we're really going to go with the second path today, because just for time's sake, you could spend forever talking about either one of these things, but we're going to look at data sets that pre-exist. So some places to find data include sort of the government, non-government organizations. So certainly places and agencies like the USGS, anything the US government has a lot of good data sets. But you can also find things internationally. UN has a lot of good data. Data.gov is obviously where where the US houses a lot of its data. And places like the World Bank. The IMF has it. A lot of larger conglomerations, multinational conglomerations will have open data sets that everyone can just use. Then there's sort of the research org piece. ICPSR is a good place to look, a lot of social science data, but they're expanding their holdings actually a lot. So I actually went to the University of Michigan last summer to talk a lot about what they're doing. They actually just added some Data Lumos is their new sort of launch product to sort of save and house government information across a lot of different subjects. But you do have to be a member institution to be able to access that. So sometimes you don't have the hefty fees available. But there are other places to go. Scientific data is one. So CRADA, I mean, we're just sort of pick these together. OSDC, sometimes they're open source. You just need to sign for an account. But there are also sort of these places we like just call parking lots, right? The parking lots are places like GitHub. And GitHub has a ton of open access data. I mean, journalistic, I don't know, depending on how you feel about journalistic integrity, but places like BuzzFeed, which actually does collect a lot of data on a lot of really important topics, pretty much have their data open and available for people to use at GitHub. GitHub is really a place to learn how to code and figure out ways to process the data, but the data is already there for you to play with. Also, Amazon Web Services, I was surprised to note, is also launching into this like open data repository thing. A lot of places are doing this because government information is so freely available. They're just sort of gobbling it up to kind of make a more robust collection of data sets, but then also encouraging the public to crowdsource or post other data sets. And then data.world. I kind of like data.world because you can go there and see like how many people are reporting instances of citing Bigfoot and where in the United States. But you can also do other things like, I think they have a bunch of like data that NASA owns or NASA has produced, so you can kind of run the gamut with them. And sort of the data quality checklist always kind of comes back to where it came from. So who collected it is really important. Do those people have credentials? If they don't, sort of how are they affiliated with the subject they're starting? Why? Well, were they answering a particular question? Is that question documented? Can we find out what they are doing? Who paid to collect the data? This becomes really important. So I was working with a student who was doing a lot of work on fracking, and she had a report and some data from a particular source that she got from a state agency website, not Massachusetts. And as we looked at it, it was really sort of pro-fracking in a way I had not seen before. And I was like, where did this come from? As we traced it, the funding source was actually Flint Hills Resources, which is a subsidiary of the Koch brothers industries, who have a vested interest in telling a particular story about how fracking is not as bad as everyone says. So sometimes who funds the collection of the data does matter in terms of what the agenda is, what the bias is. Now, in her case, she was like, well, now I can't use it. That doesn't actually mean you can't use it. In fact, it's probably useful to have both sides. But she does have to acknowledge there is a bias there. And that bias also happens even at the government level. There's some governments of the world that, produce a lot of data, but you're not actually sure that that's the story that's actually being told in that place. So you usually have to go to another place like the UN to corroborate it, but sometimes it's the only source you have. And if you acknowledge the bias of the originator, it still is usable, but you always have to acknowledge that there might be flawed with that data. The date of creation matters. How old is it? Is it being updated or maintained? Are there different versions? Are you dealing with the most recent version? Is there a quality control to it? A place like ICPSR has very strict standards about how and what you can deposit in ICPSR. They want you to be very strict about your metadata rules, how robust your data sets are, what other supporting documentation you have. Data.world, not so much. You can pretty much just post anything. So kind of knowing the difference between the two. And again, that supporting documentation. Sometimes you don't need supporting documentation. We'll look at some of the data sets today. Some of them don't need it. Some of them do. Some of them have it. Some of them don't. And that's sort of always a question you have to ask. Yeah.
And then something to consider also is the format. So is this something that I can read? Do I need this obscure software to open it? Or is more portable? Like it's a CSV file, it's in Excel, it's something that I can open using different software. So that's something to keep in mind. So it touches on the second point. Do I have the software to open that type of data, or which version? Yeah, so it could be, especially with this, if it's a Stata or SPSS data set, sometimes they use an old version of the software and it's not usable anymore. Do I have ways to move that data around or not? So those are some of the things to take into account when we look at the format of the file. Also, we take a look at the fields or the values, the variables that they are tracking with that data set. Do we have a code book or a data dictionary, like different people call them in different ways? So basically the code book is going to tell you what the values mean, if there are labels or not. So I took an example from a study from the National Science Foundation Service of Public Attitudes Towards an Understanding of Science and Technology. So that's an actual question. So when we open that data set, we see that for that question they have 1, 2, 7, 8, and 9. So what does it mean when we see those numbers? Yeah, so this question was asking people, does the Earth go around the Sun, or does the Sun go around the Earth? Yeah, so we have the different labels for the different values that we see in the data set. Yeah, so I look at the data, and actually 20% of the respondents think that the Sun goes around the Earth. So just in 2006, it was the last round of that survey. So do we have a code so that we can make sense of the values? Do we have metadata? Is it easy to find? So I think you librarians are very used to that term, metadata. Is it clean? So do we have multiple values in one cell? Or do all the dates come in the same format? Or does it have does it use capital letters across the whole data set or not? So is it clean? Yeah, so does it have missing values? How are they flagged, the missing values, or is it doing anything about that? So those are things to keep in mind when we check the quality of a data set. If we have like a messy data set, there are tools to make it clean. OpenFind, that's an open source tool that we can use to clean a data set. It's pretty easy to use, I think, and it does those kind of things. Like if you have multiple entries in one cell, it will separate them out. Or if you have, let's say, dates in different formats, it will clean that out for you. We also have Trifacta. It's also free. Anyone can use that. And then, of course, we can use other tools like Excel. Like I clean most of my data with Excel, and then I move it to other tools. So there are ways to get a clean data set. And then we have tools to do the analysis if we need to. It depends on what you want to do. If you need something more sophisticated like regression analysis, time series analysis, things like that, you might need more robust tools like Stata, R, SPSS. Those are like the main ones. You're going to end up using, I don't know, like the one in your field. Like I know in the sciences, I don't know, like people, now most people are trying to move to R because it's open source. It's not that easy to learn, but it's something to keep in mind. Excel is good if you don't need much, like if you just need like a few frequency tables or things like that. You can use Excel. It could be good for basic visualization too. And then you have
ArcGIS.
Yeah, ArcGIS. You can use that tool for visualize your data on a map. You have to have a license, so that could be a problem if you don't have one. But there are other open source tools for visualize your data in a map. Yeah, so those are some of the tools that most researchers might be using to do the analysis.
And I want to say another thing about sort of clean data, right? We're in social sciences, so we have a lot of qualitative, that's like survey answers and needing to be weighed, and we have a lot of quantitative, which are just sort of the hard number facts. A lot of the things we work with students now, when they're like, I found this data set, and I'm going to make these, and it's doing this, and we're finding this conclusion. And I'll look at the data set, and it will be a survey of, men of a certain age in urban New York, but they want to apply it to everybody living in, like, Lincoln, Nebraska. So we have to talk about whose voices are present in that data set and why you can't just apply it across the board. There are issues of socioeconomic levels, there are issues of gender, there are issues of age, and so we really have to, with our students, pull apart when they come to us with a data set and be like, are you sure? Let's talk about how is this relevant to you? Yeah, I see a question.
Just a quick comment
Yep.
in terms of coming out from the science end of things.
Yep.
I think it becomes research methodology.
Absolutely.
So, if some data was collected with one research method and another data which looks totally identical in columns and everything, but was a different research method, right? They need to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. Research methods matter, sample size matters, who they asked matters. And of course students are often like, I just need a data set for my class. And I'm like, well, this is the one you picked, so let's talk about it. Like, why did you pick it? Why do you think this is a thing? So it's all these extra layers that are beyond just numbers in a spreadsheet that we really have to walk them through, but are really important, really critical thinking skills they need to think about as they look at data. And we have plenty of students who come in and are like, I had one that was like, I need a data set of how many women in their 3rd trimester live in food deserts in the greater Boston area, and it would be really great to know how many of them are in FMLA. And I was like, okay, let's pull this apart. Like, first of all, let's talk about issues of privacy. Like, you can't be just walking around neighborhoods asking pregnant women, like, how long they are and, like, do they live near a grocery store? Like, so first of all, the question is, like, why do you think this all exists? And then, like, let's pull this apart in terms of, like, who might have a stake in collecting some of this information? You might have to go to the government and see how many people have claimed FMLA in that neighborhood. There might be a gender identity in that particular data set, and we might have to go to a different data set that talks about food deserts, and we might have to go to a 3rd data set and sometimes triangulate them, as long as there's something in common that we can match up. Sometimes you can't, and then what do? And she was like, well, so that just doesn't exist? I'm like, no, no, it doesn't. I love that you think it does. I'm so excited you charged in here being, I know exactly what I want, but it does not exist. There's so many problems with what you just said. And it was a really meaningful conversation, and we were able to back up a couple of levels and be able to find something meaningful for her, but she really had to change her entire vision of her paper. And I had a student recently come in and say, like, I'm doing this study on during the hostage crisis in the 70s. I want to look at what Iranian immigration was into the United States, because he really thought it was less. Like, and as it turns out, it kicked up at the last part of the. And he goes, well, I don't need it to say that. I need it to say that there was less. And I was like, it doesn't. And he goes, well, so what do we do about that? We need to change the focus of your paper. He goes, well, I don't want to. And I was like, I guess we're at an impasse. I don't really know what to do with this. So really kind of overcoming the expectations of the student is also a big part of kind of how do you maneuver around these data sets. And the idea that data exists everywhere and we love data and it's so easy to get. That's true, but there are still obstacles to what you think you can get.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's like the data part is just a piece of the whole research process, right? So sometimes you have to remind them of that whole picture. And what is your research question? The data might or might not tell or confirm your hypothesis, and you should be okay with that, and things like that. So it's like a piece of the whole research process, and sometimes they forget about that, yeah? Or, oh, I can make up my own data. Well, you have to be honest and, and transparent on how you do that, right? Like, it's like, oh, I'll just ask my friends. Well, maybe your Brandeis friends are not representative of the whole universe, right? So those are a little things to keep in mind. So we just went through a quick checklist. We have a few resources where you can go and take a look at all these concepts on data literacy. We can share the PowerPoint later with you. So we thought that it might be more meaningful to have you do some practice. So we have 13 data sets that we put together in different folders. So we're gonna give you our checklist, and so in groups.
It's really pared down, and I wrote it really big because I need new glasses, and when I go really small, I'm like, I can't read this, so I do it for me.
Yeah, we have a wide variation of topics and quality, so we're gonna give you like 20 minutes to work on your data set.
Yeah, so if you want to get in a small group, make a friend.
Yeah. And then at the end, we'll comment on what you find. Yeah.
So the first thing is the actual data. Charge for non-commercial private study research I can guess. Not so far, but that's
I'm gonna give you.
It's not.
Yeah, no, this is the range of five.
Let's try to see. I see if I can figure out. So here I went to the GS site and I went for data. So that
I'm not a fan.
is the UP's premier provider of service question is, wait, it's a .uk, so it's not like a .org, just like our What is I think it's on another site. Like if we looked at the budget appropriation. Okay, what else? Depends who's in charge of your government. So if you think about what census, so I think the bias of administration is geological data is a little different from climate change. I think the bias will come in not in like necessarily numbers, but in what you're looking for. So like, let's say this electric station, all our president, maybe they would seriously stop. I really think it's telling a lot of librarians. Wait, actually it's not. What are they collecting or not collecting? Good question. Let's map it. Maybe it's in, my guess will be
Yes.
population BGS observatory at the BGS is the nice to get to what other countries monitor weather. Okay, it does make me wonder, like, where's the ice system? Okay,
They're studying the ocean.
So we'll do another 2 minutes or so.
constantly watching climate and science data. Am I really giving up? We're using cutting edge technology. But they're only happening for like especially because they're in a silo of information that's yeah, okay, so the last, we have December 25th, 2015. Seems like there was a March but the data that she gave us.
Okay. Some of these data sets are really great. We tried to be very sciencey in what we picked, but some of them definitely aren't. Okay, so where's group 1? Great. Do you just want to walk us through your sheet a little bit? Talk about what data set you got. I don't. Do you want to? I think I'll interfere if I can't stand too close. I'll interfere. I'll be back.
Okay, so this database was created, we found it through USGS. It was created by a couple of researchers, and I just realized we didn't see their affiliation, did we? Oh, they work for USGS, about the genetic markers of these fish and their movement. Big head carp. They're very conceited. We think the source of funding was USGS, but there was a link to an article that was published in the Journal of Great Lakes Research that Bowdoin doesn't subscribe to, so I couldn't get to it because it's a Springer journal, behind the paywall.
Yep.
It's fairly recent. It didn't indicate that it was being updated or maintained, and all you needed was Excel to open it, although it's the data file. We had to unzip it.
We made them all Excel. Some of them were SPSS. We went through it.
Yeah.
Margarita went through and converted a bunch of them. So the answer to that question for everybody will be like, I just opened it with Excel.
Oh, okay. But there were commented CSV that can be opened by Excel.
Yep.
So, there was documentation. It wasn't that helpful, I didn't think. But they tried.
Yeah.
We found the metadata. It wasn't that helpful.
Okay, that happens too.
It seemed to, but they had good notations. I think if we had longer with it, we would have been able to say, okay, they were methodical and they agreed about what they were going to call each field and things like that. Research questions where are the big-headed carp things? Yeah. So,
Legit.
Yeah, and they used genetic markers. So they did genetic sampling and analysis.
The methodology was in the article, it wasn't in the...
Wasn't actually in the
Yeah, the methodology was in the
documentation, right?
article, not the
which that happened.
documentation for
Yeah.
the USGS. But at least it would be easy to contact these people, assuming they're still there.
Yeah, and that's the question. Great, perfect. Group 2.
So we got a little bit of a late start because ours wouldn't open on a tablet.
Oh no.
We did find a laptop. So we had migrating bird survey along the San Pedro River. And the data set looks like it was created by the U.S. Geological Survey. They were using site observation and surveying for their methodology. It looks like the funding was from the government, but we couldn't determine that definitively. They were meeting with the PI continuing to meet with the PI to preserve the data, to maintain it, and we opened it in Excel. Was there anything else?
Did you come up with a research question that this data might contribite to answering?
I guess if you were to do a research question, your question would be how often did birds migrate to oases and riparian areas in the San Pedro Valley?
Perfect.
And to answer the other questions, there was a code book for this, and you definitely did need it to understand the data.
Sometimes you do, yeah.
There is metadata as well, and there is some quality control because they are preserving it.
Yeah, great, perfect, thanks. Group 3.
Yeah, we have 3 rows here. Okay. Our data set was called milk products, and I'll just go to the research question that I think we came up with, which is what are the radon levels in milk in the spring of 2011 in well-populated cities in the U.S.? And it's EPA created the data set, and using this RadNet laboratory analysis method, and government funded. And I think we needed a code book, and we didn't have one.
And there wasn't one, right?
Yeah,
that happens
there
sometimes
wasn't.
too.
Yeah, I figured out PCI/L is picocurie per liter, I think. So yeah, radon levels.
Yep, great. Sometimes you need the code book, and in that case, you might then write the researchers and be like, "Where's your code book? Can we have it?" And normally they're like, "Oops, sorry, here it is."
The discussion was interesting on the side. EPA has responded back and forth.
Yeah, for our part, we spent most of our time trying to figure out why the heck they had just these 2 months worth of data, and apparently it was because in response to the Fukushima reactor incident, and so they were trying to make sure that nothing in the U.S. was affected because of that. We think there were some broken links in there.
Yeah, and there was nothing in the about section on the data set, so we had to go, like you said, to the discussion, to the comments to figure out where this was from.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. You sometimes have to even put on your, Scooby-Doo hat and really dive deep into the mystery to pull it apart.
The wide variation in quality.
Yeah, the quality is not consistent.
And I wonder if some of that is because this was in response to an emergency.
Yep.
You know, by comparison, Group 4, were looking at, what's the name of the data set? Food environment data. So it's a really nice Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs. So you do need Excel, but you don't need anything fancier than that. And it has a really nice variables sheet that we could just go search for variables. It did not have full definitions in the Excel spreadsheet. And it's interesting, the most recent version of this on the USDA website, so it's USDA Economic Research Service funded, and there are contact informations. But it was funny, they posted the latest version of the spreadsheet and they didn't post a new version of the documentation. But you can use the previous versions. But I didn't notice it immediately. You pointed it out to me. But it's definitely much more deliberately built than something as fast as what the previous group was working on. Yeah, it has a code book. You can use the previous version's documentation. They tell you about changes. They tell you what missing data means broadly. And what research questions. This is about grocery store availability, food sources, restaurants. So a lot of it would be stuff that would be useful in food desert research. So food deserts and how they correlate with any number of other public health issues would probably be the ways you would use this.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Who's number 5?
So we were Group 5. Our data set was aquaculture data, and it was from the USDS. And, actually I realized I didn't write down what date it was created, but let's see. It has so it was a government source of funding, and it actually opened up very easily in Excel, and it looked, there was The code book, actually, and the information, it was actually, there was some, but it wasn't great. You had to do a lot of digging. Like, for the code book, they said, see U.S. Census Bureau's codes. So we'd have to dig up another. And so I never ended up finding the metadata. And some of the field variables, we could kind of tell, like, there was kg, so for your kilograms, but, like, I don't know, it would have been nice if there was something that just says that's really what they were using it for. And missing data, well, there was actually 3 different databases, and we each opened up a different one. The imports were actually different format from the exports. And then the catfish, which is the one I did, ended in, even though it said it was updated every month, it actually stopped in 2008. Nope. So, and what research question could be answered by this data? I figured, what's the price of fish throughout the last 10 years?
Sure, some longitudinal studies on cost. And the thing is, those are mostly all from government sources, even some of the same government sources, and they vary wildly. Like, there's just no consistency.
Number 6.
All right, so our data set was greenhouse gas emissions. It was created by the SEEG initiative. It was compiled from raw data, collected both, it looked like through a variety of methods in Brazil between 1970 and 2015. There were numerous sources of funding, and we started digging into what some of them were, because there were foundations that on kind of surface level sounded really good, but we weren't sure if they were kind of wolves in sheep's clothing, I guess.
Precisely, yeah.
But indeed, they did look like they were truly environmentally, had solid environmental interests, and did in fact believe, like their bias perhaps was that they believed science, that climate change does exist. Let's see. We didn't need special software to open we just used Excel, a million tabs, and we just were getting to exploring the data when people started reporting out. So can I hand you the mic to just talk a little bit about some of the...
Okay, sure. So there actually is a relatively robust README as the first tab,
Nice work.
where it defines, the different sectors and gases and estimations, how they were being made, how to create pivot tables of the data. There is a version history, although it does not include what changed. It just tells you when it was published and what data it includes. And then it's got a couple of sort of massive, all of the national level data on one page kind of thing, and all the state level data. And then it's got their hierarchy trees for how they were measuring levels of emissions. So it is a very robust data set. We were working off of, they have a sort of quick Figshare intro to the data set, and then there is also a scientific data publication, which is where we found things like who funded it, about the data set itself.
Yeah.
And it seems to have been put together in response to the Paris Climate Accords, which is why it goes to 2015.
Right. And then any ideas what you might use a research question that might use this data set?
If you were looking for the particular contributions to a national emission of agriculture or of forestry or something like that, this is probably a really good place to get it.
Yeah. Yeah, so especially with those multi-tab database studies and those really robust data sets, oftentimes, especially with my students, they're using only subsets of that, right? They'll look at this data set and they're like, nothing in here is usable. I'm like, yeah, except for you're talking about, how many Roma are unemployed in the EU, but you only want Romania. That is actually here. You just need to ignore all the rest of the tabs. So yeah, sometimes they're really almost too robust, and so you really have to think about narrowing it down, and always go back to a research question. That's always going to sort of inform how useful the set is to you. Great.
We are number 7, the National UFO Reporting Center.
Sounds official, right?
Very official, very official. So we couldn't find a whole lot on the URL, so we went to our resource of importance that most students go to, Wikipedia. And we found that it was founded in '74, headquarters are in Davenport, Washington, and it's run by Peter Davenport, which is kind of,
I'm from Washington State, from that side of Washington State. It's right that it's in Davenport. I'm just saying.
But
It's a very good place for it.
his name is also Davenport.
Yes.
That was kind of the questionable thing. Is it a pseudonym or something? Anyway, and in 2000 and whatever, they moved to a bunker near Spokane.
That's where I'm from. Woo! Bunker City. Well, Spokane, but it's practically a bunker in and of itself.
Yeah, to a nuclear bunker. Basically, and recently they added a fax machine and a telephone.
Coming up, it's getting into that 20th century technology.
Yeah. What it is it's a place where people call in and report information that they've just seen a UFO.
Right, so the methodology is crowdsourced, right?
Crowdsourcing, exactly, yeah. And the data set had dates, locations, and what people saw. So you could kind of, the question might be, has anything been seen recently in X? And go from there.
We use this data set when we teach Excel because if you mess it up, no one cares, right? The stakes are really low with that particular data set. And we do pull, because there's elements of qualitative data. They actually have people give some details, but they actually have also codified, the shapes you might run into. They have a list of predetermined shapes that you have to choose from. It's an interesting place. Yeah, so great.
I guess I've been nominated. Okay. So we had the Law and Order data set. And they started out with the website saying something along the lines of the data has been collected by 2 separate but equally important groups: the fans of the show who watch and collect the verdicts, and those of us who put the spreadsheet together. And so that actually was tongue-in-cheek, but it was good information about the origin of this data set, which was that it was crowdsourced. So just people watched the show, and then they essentially said how the case had turned out. So it was divided up. It was in Excel format, but we actually spent most of the time looking at the documentation rather than the data because it was in a website format, and that can be, and we, full disclosure, we were looking at it on the tablet, and sometimes the mobile site appears differently than the desktop site, but we had to skip around a lot to find things like dates. So we had questions like, all right, the show is over, so we know that there's not additional incoming data or verdicts, but the site was started in 2012, and there was an update ostensibly 1 month after the site was started, and then the copyright said 2018. What changes or updates may have been made during that period? Now you may say, well, the show's over, what do you need updates for? Well, mistakes happen. And so with data sets like this, what we were thinking about was who is error checking and what would be the process for getting that corrected. And there's more than one place in which errors could be introduced. So let's say somebody watches the episode, they see that it was guilty, but then for whatever reason their accurate description gets coded wrong, and it somehow gets placed in the not guilty or the mistrial or what have you, which happens a lot because, metadata mistakes, there's no such thing, right? We know all our metadata is perfect all the time. So these were the things that we sort of, yeah.
And that one's a labor of love, right?
Yes.
So it'd be very easy for whoever was doing the spreadsheet to be like, I'm just going to do these real quick that have come in. And then it's because there was no funding and they had no accountability for it.
Yes, we saw that there was no funding.
There's no funding.
We checked that off right away. Nope, no funding.
Yeah, so mostly just fan generated. What does that mean if you don't have the bandwidth to really give it the attention to organize correctly? So, did you come up with a research question?
We had a couple possible research questions. So one of them was just, the what was it that you said that?
Comparing it to real world data and see
Right.
how this is displayed on TV versus like what happens in real life.
And then I was thinking, does it change at all since it's always ripped from the headlines? You know, was there a particular year that there were lots of guilty verdicts because the public got, you know, anxious about crime and we wanted to see strong punishment on TV or something like that?
Yeah, there's definitely some cultural kinds of things you can pull out of
Right, since we
what
know
you watch on TV.
Right, since we know what year every season aired.
Right, exactly. Thanks.
Thank you. Our data set was called the Pew Research Center Data on Science Marches.
Oh.
And it was, yes, created May 3rd to the 7th in 2017. It was created by the Pew Research Center on Science and Society. And they conducted cell phone interviews of 1,012 adults in 50 states, plus DC, in English and Spanish. And the source of funding, well, we saw that Pew was funded by charitable donations, but we didn't see who contributed to this particular project. And so we don't know whether there's much bias there or not, but I think, don't know. Anyway, is it being updated? It had 2 releases within 5 days of each other in 2017 and then not since. The problem that we had was it was in SPSS and we didn't have SPSS, so we couldn't look at the data. But we could see, the code book and documentation looked quite complete. It had a really good explanation of the fields that were available, but we were not able to check the actual data to see if we were missing anything. And all we could see was metadata in the code book and README files, and those looked quite complete, very good. A possible research question, we thought, well, if somebody was looking at blue versus red states and their support for science research, there could be some information here.
Yeah, great, yeah. Sorry about that. We tried to convert, Margarita really tried to convert. I'm gonna give her all the credit because she did it longer than I did.
This on my computer, so I just like, oh yeah, I can open it. So number 10? Oh.
So our data set was on agricultural incentives. It was created by the World Bank's research project, Distortions to Agricultural Incentives. And it was funded by the World Bank Trust Funds, and it named 2 funding sources in particular, the UK Department of International Development and BNPP. So those are, BNPP is an international banking group, so it's a little hard to decipher what potential biases might be included in those funding sources. Yeah, BNPP was accused at one point of laundering large amounts of money and conspiracy to cover such, and yeah, really exciting stuff. So,
yeah, so their information is probably pretty clean, right?
Yeah, totally. Great, funding source you really want to be connected with. So, yeah, we want to also believe that the World Bank is trying to do nice things, and so grains of salt with everything. It was last updated in 2017, you guys said, so being maintained at least relatively recently. We could open it in Excel. And there is a sheet in the Excel sheet called Variables, which explains some of the funding sources and the actual, the column titles and what they mean. That being said, you need to have more of a knowledge of business than I do, at least, to understand the variable names.
That's fair.
The metadata is findable, but there is some missing data that is not accounted for in the actual data sheet. So that was a bit of a mystery.
Data also goes from 1955 to 2007, sort of, so we're not sure when the website says last updated 2017, like what was last updated.
Right.
But yeah, with the
Could have just been the header on the website, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but with the huge time frame, I mean, it makes sense that there's missing data.
Yeah. Great. And did you have a question?
So for research questions, it's basically looking at subsidies in different countries for agriculture. So like what kind of money are they getting from their governments? So anything that has to do with how are governments supporting their agriculture? How are the farms producing? Are there anything in there? Like those kinds of questions can all be answered with that, but it's a huge data set.
Yeah,
that's huge.
World Bank loves to do that.
Oh, they love data.
Makes
It's all
all
over
of
the
my
place.
students cry. They don't like it. It's good data. Great. And I think we have 2 groups left, right? You guys and you, and so I think we have and this group. You did those. Okay, so I think there's one group down here and there's one over here, and then because we have about 5 minutes. So I think it's
ours was the China environmental quality pollution. Let me pull it up. It's up there. Yes, China pollution indicators and stats. And the data, it took us a little digging. There's a README when you open up the zip file. And there's a white paper linked from the data landing page. But apparently, some of the data comes from an environmental quality report produced by the China National Environmental Monitoring Station up to 1991. Then the folks compiling this data looked at China environmental yearbooks from China's national EPA. And the metadata for the data set says it goes to 93. When we opened the spreadsheets, they went to 95. So that's an interesting question. There is no code book, and while some of the things were fairly self-evident, pH and CO2, there were other things that less evident. So code book would have been nice. Missing data, there were empty cells all over the place. And well, it's from the Chinese government, their EPA, so funding was very opaque. I mean, I don't know how they work. They might have gotten a Koch brother, sponsorship. Being maintained, the data landing page said last updated July 2017. I think much like the last group, it's probably something on that website that was updated 2017 because the Excel sheets only go to 95. Questions? I mean, it lists an environmental monitoring station, so I have no particular reason to doubt that the values that are present are incorrect. So you could say some things about the water or air quality in, it lists specific cities in China, so you could get a little specific about it, but I would really like more metadata.
the story of our lives, isn't it? Really like a little more metadata. And last group.
So our data was weather station data from a site in Iceland, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce. That's it. Which once we saw that it was coming from the British Geological Survey, and once we went to their website, we saw that it was a site of a glacier. And it looked like the data was collected starting in 2009 and appeared to end at the end of 2014, recorded on an Excel file. Appears to be a British government agency, so any bias would just be whatever the particular administration might have. There does seem to be a metadata file. The readings were hourly, so it was difficult to tell because it was so big whether there was any missing readings, but definitely could be used to answer some questions regarding glacier melting, climate change, anything along those lines.
Great, okay, thanks. So as we can see, everyone kind of had different types of data. There was crowdsourcing, there was surveying, there was phone calls, there was actually just measurements. But nobody's data set was really perfect, which is why you kind of, every time you're dealing with something you're looking at yourself or working with a student or a researcher, go through a particular checklist to be like, hey, let's look at these items. Does a no on any of these things make the data set unusable? No, actually. In some cases, if you're working sometimes with China-related data, the only information you have is coming from the government. But you have to acknowledge that may not be the whole story. That's usually what I tell my researchers, like, is it unusable? Well, first I always say, like, let's see if the UN has something that can corroborate this. So maybe looking for another source to corroborate or add more context, but also acknowledging where the data is limited does kind of make it a little bit easier to use some of these data sets. Is there any questions while we wrap up? Because I know that you get to go to lunch and have, not in this room, do something exciting. If you have any questions, we'll make sure you get the slides. You'll have our emails. If you have anything you want to contribute, like there's a really great data set about this show, you should send it to us because we'd love to see it. But yeah, anything else before we let you out of here?
I have a few things to say once your questions for them are done, but first let's thank all of our presenters. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. Questions? It's the end of a long boot camp, that's fine. All right, I think Ellen has a few things to say about boot camp in general. I'm going to switch to my computer for the evaluations. We'd like you to fill out evaluations. We do have a button for this session as well.
Okay, here, I'll grab this one so I'm not over there. Okay, are we on? Okay. Yeah, a couple of things. First of all, I will mention for those of you who are maybe first timers, I will just caution you that the button for the Capstone is a little bit different, and we do that intentionally. We have kind of a theme for those. We just added a button for the Capstone starting 2 years ago at UMass Dartmouth when our Capstone was one of the librarians from WPI who works with one of the biology professors there, and it was about science, kind of doing science literacy for undergrads. So we went with the theme of that for the I Speak Science. And so we have kept with the I Speak theme. So just to give you background, because I was showing this to some people at work, just trying to get for readability of the font and things. And yeah, my one colleague, he's like, I don't understand what that means. I'm like, okay, hopefully boot camp people will. So, and also I would just also caveat, evaluation is a really long word, so anyway. So Jennifer is actually going to have those. If you attended previous sessions of this boot camp and did not get your button, see me. I have all of the other sessions, the buttons for all the other sessions. One thing we also try to do at the end of boot camp, and I know that we, several of us on the planning committee had some people kind of asking us questions last night about sort of the boot camp model. So you've heard us talk about the planning committee. So those of you who've been to many boot camps, you've heard this spiel in some sort. But we just like to let you know kind of how boot camp actually works. So we have the planning committee is made up of, as Barbara mentioned last night, librarians from various institutions. And how you get a seat on the planning committee is you'll notice we do not have vendor sponsorship for this. That is a very intentional thing that we do. So we have institutional financial sponsorship instead. So all of us that are on the planning committee, our institutions have made a $1,000 contribution sponsorship towards boot camp. And that's kind of how you get a seat at the table for the planning. Per year, yeah. So it's a yearly thing. And that helps pay for, because yeah, we keep our costs low, and most places your registration cost covers the dorm and most of the meals that you cover, but any of the extra things, including we do have small honoraria that we give the speakers, special events, sometimes renting, we have to pay extra to rent the room for our special evening. So, a lot of those things are covered by the sponsorships. And so, you do though, the nice thing is part of that sponsorship money goes towards paying for your one planning committee member from your institution to attend boot camp. So most of us, there's one person from our institution, so we get to come for free. But we're working the whole time.
Except for all that work you did.
Except for all that work we did, yes. Yeah, so that's kind of how boot camp all comes together. Our cycle is we pretty much spend 11 months planning boot camp. We take July off. And then in August, usually before the semester starts, the planning committee will have an in-person meeting to do our debrief from the last boot camp and start looking for at next year. The first thing we try to do is identify a host. Sometimes from an existing planning committee member, sometimes like the year we were at Bowdoin, Sue came on board because they wanted to host, so she just joined the planning committee for that 1 year. So that's the other thing, is it's not necessarily you're making a commitment that you're always going to be on the planning committee. You know, obviously we know things change, administrations change, support changes. And that's, yeah, and it's on the evaluation. If you are interested in either joining the planning committee or becoming a host in the future, you can indicate it on the overall evaluation, or that would kind of make you lose your anonymity. So you also can email Sarah Olker, and they have their email address on the evaluation. So again, we gave you your buttons anyway, so yeah, we do appreciate you filling out evaluations for all the sessions, including today's capstone. The overall evaluation is, as a longtime planning committee member, that's the one that is really important for us, because the other stuff it's all important, but that's where you can make suggestions on topics for both the capstone and science topics that you would like to see covered. If you know of a good speaker, you could even, in that area, you can mention it. Kind of the other things we do is some of the fun activities, whether you think having the Tuesday night stay is a good idea. I think planning committee has pretty much said that's something that we have to have, because it's really helpful for us to get here the day before. Please do fill those out. Again, that's one that I know a lot of people kind of want to take some time to decompress, or you're kind of brain dead by now. So these will all be, we'll keep these links active for at least a week. Usually we do like 2 weeks after boot camp. We will send a reminder out next week with links, encouraging you, especially for the overall evaluation, because topic ideas. So that's all there. And topics, then once we have a host chosen, we kind of go with topics from there. We look at the suggestions you have, but then we also try to pull from the strengths of the institution that is hosting. So you'll notice this year we had lots of Brandeis speakers, and we like to kind of feature the local talent. Again, using Bowdoin as the example, when we went there, Bowdoin's small, they had some folks, but Sue, kind of we pulled from Colby and Bates and some of the other colleges around. So we do that, and as you know, trying to find faculty who are going to be around in June and available is sometimes a bit of a challenge. So. And then again, on the planning committee, we meet virtually a lot throughout the year. We try to usually have at least 1 or 2 additional in-person meetings. I think finally decided January was not necessarily a good time to try to be driving halfway across the state of Massachusetts, because the weather is sketchy. Anyway, so does anybody have questions about that? Planning committees, or anything that I didn't mention that? So we just like to kind of give you an overview of, because I know there were a few people last night that asked me. We are always open to new folks on the planning committee. Again, if your school is willing to make that commitment. And what was I going to say? And then we have the LibGuide. Typically, just as an FYI, especially for newer folks. Whether or not it happens, we tend to coincide our opening registration with the eScience Symposium, which is like the first week of April. And I know some of the other boot camps are on a different kind of cycle, but we tend to be late with that, or later than some of them are. But that's kind of the standard. And that's it. Well, so I want to say, yes, Carolyn. Oh yeah, I would say I want to, having been one of the hosts at UMass Amherst last year, I know how much work that is. So I want us to once again acknowledge Melanie Raddick and Brandeis for such a great show. And we're looking forward to, well, after a break, we're all looking forward to next year. So we hope to see you then. And Melanie, do you have any final thoughts?
Just reminders mostly. Anybody who hasn't given me your key, give me your key. Lanyards, we got a pile here. You do have lunch, so if you still have your swipe card, yeah, I'll be at lunch. Find me, I can take them. Swipe cards are not as important as the keys.
Do you need to return linens or anything?
No, you shouldn't need to do anything with the room except get your stuff out of it. And folks who are coming on the field trip, we're meeting in the theater lot at 1:30 to 1:45.
Melanie, are you going on that field trip such that people need to get your keys to you by then?
I am going on that field trip. You can give me your key when I get back at 4:30, but by the end of today, by then, is your absolute cutoff. And I think that's everything. Nope, one more thing.
If you are a mentor or a mentee and you have the big button, you're welcome to take that with you if you want, but if it's not something you're attached to, if you would leave that with your lanyard too, that way we can recycle those again and use those. Okay, we're slim budget, so we try to recycle, reuse as much as we can.